New Minds Nation. Welcome to another edition of the New Minds podcast. I'm your host, Ben Cook, co-founder and CEO of New Minds and host of the New Minds podcast. Today we have a very impressive guest with a very long CV, which I'm not going to be able to give you a complete picture of, but I'm going to give you a taste. Our guest today is Dr. Jenny Grant Rankin, and she is a Fulbright specialist for the U.S. Department of State. She has taught in the postdoc masterclass at the University of Cambridge. She has 2 doctorates, which I'm going to ask her a little bit more about. She has served in all capacities in terms of education, from teacher, a principal, assistant principal, a district administrator, and even this cool title, Chief Education and Research Officer, which I also want to ask a little bit more about. That sounds awesome. In terms of her contributions and accomplishments, media appearances on NPR, NBC News, Newsweek, Oprah Magazine, Reader's Digest, The Wall Street Journal. What a voice for education in all these mainstream media outlets. I can't wait to hear more about that as well. She's delivered over 200 keynotes. She has a TED Talk, which I'll link to in the show notes when I post this. 12 books, 157 papers in 38 different publications. Just a real complete and passionate contributor and researcher in the field of education. Dr. Jenny Grant Rankin, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. I'm so excited.
Yeah, I would love to start, if you don't mind, with just a little discussion about your story. Like what brought you into this world of education? Not just that, but then to keep kind of climbing up into higher and higher levels of platforms and ways to contribute, and that curiosity that must drive a lot of this research that you do. Just tell us a little bit about your journey.
Well, it really just came from passion. I started my career as a junior high school English teacher, and I was working a lot with leveraging data to really target what each kid was missing and what each kid needed, so that nobody fell through the cracks. And as I was doing that, I started to realize how difficult data was for people. And so I got some additional roles where I was training colleagues. And as I advanced through the education system into these roles of, technically higher roles, but of more influence, I was really just passionate about reaching more students. And I loved seeing my influence grow. I missed that one-on-one with kids, but I still get that through Mensa, because teachers have that amazing chance to connect in a way that other educators don't get that chance. But I loved just seeing my influence grow. And if I was training or working with teachers, then I was impacting not just students in my classroom, but their students too. And along the way, I got very fascinated with how we could make teachers' jobs easier and how we could make their understanding of data more accurate and easy, because educators are using data to make decisions that impact students, and most are misunderstanding the data. So that really branched into, I wanted to conduct a study. I wanted to get my Ph.D. And when I went on to do those things, I was realizing I don't want it just to sit in a journal or behind a paywall online. I have these findings, students are being hurt, and I have these findings, and I want to get them out so that all these great people who are dedicated to helping students can have an easier job doing that, and a more effective job doing that. So I got very fascinated with how to get out of our silos in the education field, instead of just researchers publishing in journals that busy teachers are too swamped to read and comb through, and then also teachers communicating these fantastic strategies in the teacher's lounge to colleagues, but they're way too swamped to be out at certain conferences and, that are being frequented by policymakers and so on. There's just so much communication in silos, and to really get students the best help we can, we need to hear those educators on the news, and we need all of those voices represented in different areas. There's one study in particular found that 11% of the education experts that are on the news, and this looked at a range of programs and conducted over 10 months. It was very extensive. Only 11% either have worked as a teacher at some point or have some sort of advanced degree in education. Either of those things, only 11% of those, expert guests. And so we've got a lot of instances of voices missing from important conversations.
Yeah, so a massive disconnect that you notice, and I always find it fascinating. It's become kind of a trend that even just here on the podcast, we've had some guests who started their careers as teachers, saw a problem, and then there are different pathways that they've taken. Some have gone entrepreneurial and created a business to solve the problem, and some have gone deeper and deeper into education and research and academia to solve the problem. I love it in your case. I'm not surprised at all that you started off as an English teacher, because it's really the essence of what you're talking about is communication. It's a major gap that you saw, like you described it, the silos between, the research going on in academia. They're kind of insular, right? They were kind of like speaking to themselves. They have their own sub-language that they understand amongst each other, but it wasn't getting where it needed to get, which was in the minds and practices of teachers to actually benefit the kids. Like, isn't that the point of the research? And so you saw this need, and I know one of the themes of your career has been helping educational researchers reframe how they communicate their findings so that it is accessible and relatable to the everyday practitioner. So can you give some examples of this in action, of educators who have maybe had a good insight within academic research, and then found a way to communicate it?
Yes, and there are so many avenues open for that, but sadly, it's not communicated. Like when you're getting your PhD and you have a checklist of what you need to do from the IRB. There's a little checkbox, and this is at any institution where I've looked at. There's a little checkbox: disseminate. After you have your findings, disseminate. But it's not really taught in an effective way. It might be through some mentors, some mentoring, but then that's a problem too, because there are some voices that have traditionally been excluded from mentoring and being invited onto panels and so on. But there are some great things that are very easy to do. For example, there are databases that journalists use when they're trying to find an expert. One of them is the Public Insight Network that's used by NPR, the New Yorker, all these big players. And another one is Source Search. It's the Educational Writers Association, and they have thousands of journalists that write specifically for education. And they use these databases to find experts. And it takes 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes max, to put your information in there, whether you're a researcher for education or a classroom teacher or a principal, whatever your role, and even a student can put, is information there, or a parent. You put keywords, and then you're just that much more accessible for journalists. And there are services you can sign up for, and they're free, like helpareporter.com. It's HARA or HARO, Help a Reporter Out is what the tool is. Yeah. And hotkettle.com can filter them for you. There are these services you can sign up for, and then you can even set up filters on your inbox so you don't get all of them, that just give you stuff that has a keyword that relates to your interests. But this way, instead of going out there and having to pitch journalists like, hey, I have something to share and I want to get on the air, and I want to, you can just sit back and do that incredible work you're doing and that you're so busy doing. Yeah. And then they come to you. And then with these filters, instead of getting, because otherwise it's a lot of daily messages about all kinds of topics that you're not an expert in, but with just using filters, you suddenly get only those that relate to you, and you just want to respond very quickly, 30 minutes if you can, 60 minutes, even if they say that you have a few days to respond, because journalists are so busy. And then suddenly you're on the air. And I talk about journalists a lot because what happens in the media influences public opinion, and public opinion influences policymakers and what politicians, pick as their next big topic, and their slant on issues. So the media is really a great way to influence all these different facets of a field that ultimately touch students.
Yeah, I love that. And so I don't know if this is accessible to the general public or if I just got lucky, but I got this document that you sent me. It's 4 pages of ideas about how to get on the radar of media outlets as a speaker, as an interviewee, whatever that might be. And it's powerful. I'll have to tell you, a lot of things got added to my to-do list because there were so many gaps in me personally. And so that's one thing. So I want to, on the one hand, if I'm an education researcher and I want my voice out there, I want to be able to communicate to a mainstream audience. This is one beautiful way to make myself accessible to mainstream media outlets and try to communicate my findings. So that being said, I might have done some research within an academic institution. The insights are very powerful and impactful, and they need to get out there. And maybe I even go through the steps of making myself available, but I still have to cater my message effectively, right? So that's the next step. How do you help academics cater their message?
That's huge. I love that you brought that up, because if you get the opportunity to, say, speak on a radio show or be on the news, and you don't know how to get your point across, you've wasted that opportunity. And if anything, you've turned people off to your topic because people get really overwhelmed by jargon and by something that sounds too complicated. Just because even people who are super smart are super busy, right? So one thing that I teach educators to do, and researchers and others, is first they have to figure out what is the main thing they want to get across. What is the main thing they want to share with the world? And they might tweak it for different audiences. If I'm talking to parents versus if I'm talking to teens versus if I'm talking to a congressman, I'm going to adjust my message. But you want to narrow down your message down to one sentence. And when you know that one sentence that you want to get across, it's a lot easier while you're communicating to be aware, am I really getting that across or not? Another thing is to scale back any language that your next door neighbor wouldn't understand, in any terms. When people hear an unfamiliar term, a word they don't understand or they're unsure about, an emotional filter comes up. And you know about this from education, of course, like kids where English is their second language and they hear a word they don't know. This happens a lot to them. That literally blocks their understanding of other information that they would normally understand just fine. So you really have to figure out what language can I use that can reach everybody. That if I have an audience, maybe a lot of them are familiar with most of the terms, but you want to reach everybody, right? So you figure out, well, who else might not understand that, and what words can I swap in? And also coming up with talking points. This is my main message. What key points do I want to get across along with that message? Thinking about all of this stuff ahead of time is going to make it a lot easier to be successful in a speaking engagement. And also it's going to be easier to check something you've written and look back at it and say, okay, does this main message stand out? If somebody passed this on to someone, would it be conveyed? Yeah. And I know one thing I talk about a lot is stories, and that's another sort of category of the best ways to communicate information. We need to make it emotional. We need to make it engaging. And our societies built over thousands of years were built up around stories that we share between one another. And when you share something in a story form, it's so much more memorable, actionable, and intriguing, and people are just more likely to pass it on to others than they would if we do those boring bullet points that just turn people off. And the brain's always looking for, what can I forget? What is something I can forget? Because if we took in all information around us, we would be overwhelmed. We only remember 2 months after a 10-minute presentation, we only remember about 2% of what we've heard or read. So you definitely want to embed things in stories so that they become memorable and touch people.
Yeah, I love that. So, the core philosophy of New Minds from a learning point of view for students is the power of narrative. You're preaching to the choir on that. We understand that we're, even neurologically, we're wired to create stories and to create plots and characters and protagonists. And I love that. I'm wondering if you could walk us through an example, starting with, okay, here's a research finding, or here's a big aha. And first state it in like academic terms, like, kind of less internal insular language. And then can you walk us through that process really quick? How could I turn that into a sentence for my next door neighbor? How could I turn that into maybe a narrative or a story if I were sharing it on a TEDx stage, for example?
Oh, I'd love to do that. One that I use a lot because I'm often teaching others how to communicate in these ways is to start with the boring part, and the part that we usually end up as bullet points on a slide. Multiple studies have found that when you present, it's really important to cater to your audience and to adjust your entire approach based on your audience's needs, and to be flexible enough to be paying attention to feedback from your audience so that you can adjust as needed to constantly target their needs. So that would be, very dry, mentioning studies. It's a little, but if I were talking to my next door neighbor and I did want to just simplify that, I could just say, when you're presenting, it's vital that you stay flexible enough to cater to your audience's needs. Or I could just say, always speak in a way your audience can understand. I can simplify it even further. But I would be sure to accompany that with a story. And so when I teach this need to listen to your audience, pivot on a dime for whatever your audience needs, I tell them a story of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Because we're all familiar with him. So I don't have to give you a lot of backstory. It doesn't take a lot of time. And I ask my audience, what's the most famous line from his most famous speech? And it's, I have a dream. Everybody knows that. Everybody's heard that speech. But what they don't know is that even though Dr. King meticulously wrote out every speech ahead of time and had every single word planned, he never intended to say those words, I have a dream, on that day. What happened was, at his most influential speech ever, arguably, he was 11 minutes into the speech. And Mahalia Jackson, a gospel singer who was seated up on the stage behind him, she was listening and she'd heard a lot of his speeches, and she just wasn't feeling it. He just wasn't getting there. And Dr. King, of course, is spanning the audience, and you get those signals if your audience is intrigued or if they're kind of tuned out. And Mahalia Jackson started shouting at him, Martin, tell him about the dream, Martin. Tell him about the dream. Tell him about the dream. And Dr. King was taking in those signals from his audience, and he was really listening to them. And he heard the truth in that. He realized, I'm not getting to my audience. I need to touch those emotions. And so right there, he went completely off script for quite a big segment. And he launched into those words, I have a dream. And he went on that whole tangent that when we see transcripts of the speech, that's the part that we see, right? And the impact of him being that flexible and listening to his audience, catering to their needs, the impact of that was world changing. All because he did all those things that I could have put in bullet form, right? That I could have just rattled off those facts. But instead, by telling that story, you're going to remember that story. And your memory event will be triggered when you see images of Dr. King. And you'll probably tell others that story because it's novel, it's unique, it's something a lot of people don't know. And when you tell them that story, you're also passing on that message, that main message of the power of being flexible and catering to your audience's needs.
Yeah, and so boom, like I have my emotional reaction. Like I literally get goosebumps whenever I hear that anecdote, right? So I have the emotional reaction. I'm completely vested in that sense, and then I'm connecting it to the layman's approach to describing it as be adaptive to your audience, take feedback from your audience, and then from there, there's the link to the actual research that we started with. And the cycle's kind of complete, but you're getting your point across. I love that. So, okay, so bridging that gap between research and actual educators so that the impacts and the benefits reach students, beautiful. But it's now your work has kind of pivoted a little bit, and it seems like you're exploring a lot more this idea of student voices, bridging the gap with students themselves. First of all, like, why is this important in your mind? Why is it important that we empower students in this way?
Well, most of my books, or especially my earlier books, are all about using data in the education field. And arguably the most powerful source of data on students is student feedback. Are they engaged in the class? Are they interested? What do they think of this and that? It's so powerful, yet it is simultaneously possibly the least tapped data source in the education field. We're constantly measuring them academically, looking at attendance, all these sorts of things. And we never stop to ask them, how do you feel? Sometimes at the end of a school year, a teacher will survey the kids, what do you like? What do you not? But wouldn't that have been powerful to have that so much earlier? Right. And two, when you look at the media or publications or anything on the education field, so often we're not hearing from the students themselves. And this includes parenting, and all sorts of things that touch kids' lives and even their future, the environment, and so on. Look at the power, look at little Greta, look at the power of kids speaking out on climate change, or look at Malala Yousafzai, who most of us think we ask, well, how do you know that name? We think, when she was 15, she was shot in the face by the Taliban. That's that memorable thing. And later became the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize ever. But what a lot of people don't realize is that happened when she was 15. That didn't happen by chance. At age 11, she was blogging for the BBC on girls' rights to have an education. Yeah. She had that voice. And it's something where when we do hear from kids speaking out on issues, look at the Parkland students after the shootings, right? When we do hear from kids, there's a reason that the public is just riveted. That the media is, all the cameras are out, we're seeing them up, and it's because they're that firsthand authority, right? They're the ones being impacted the most by so many of the issues we talk about. But we don't tend to teach them. We talk a lot about your career when you're in the future, be ready for college. We talk a lot about the future. But the truth is that as long as we guide them in, once it's online, it's permanent. So be careful what you say. And as long as we guide them in digital citizenship, they can be sharing their voices right now. They can be in these databases. There are so many, one thing I talk about is how to give a TED Talk. And there are so many opportunities, sometimes even, or possibly even more, for students to be giving TED Talks. And there are these TED Ed clubs, and there are all these things that you can have at a school site. Yeah. There are ways that students can already be standing up and talking about their opinions, their findings from experience, their research. They're online more than many adults, right? And so they're getting all of this information, and they have incredible insights if we guide them in stepping up and say, you know what? I'm sure this reporter would love to hear from you. I look at these reporter queries, and they're constantly asking about, how do the students feel about going back to school? They want to know. But when you read what's out there, you're not very often hearing that student side. You're hearing more the teachers and the parents are talking more. But why not get kids out there? And then those, if they're already starting to be change makers at these young ages, look at what they'll do. Like, look at the Parkland students, and not just the ones we see, because there's a diversity issue where there are many students speaking out that are being underrepresented in the media. But if we really look at what everybody's saying, we know they're already having an impact. What are they going to do 5 years from now, 10 years from now? I mean, these are our change makers. These are the kids that are going to change the world, right? They're going to go on to do such great things, and why not boost them along?
Yeah. So let me adopt a persona here to ask you the next question, because I know probably some people's minds will go in this direction. So, Dr. Rankin, we live in the era of TikTok and Instagram and all these other platforms. Students have more voice than they've ever had before. They're on there all day speaking their mind. Why do they need more voice empowered? How do you answer that sentiment?
Two ways. Yeah. One, where are they communicating? Because if they want to change policy, if they want to have an impact, for example, right now, big question, should schools open up again right now during COVID-19. That's a big issue. If they want to have a say in that, if they're only communicating in TikTok videos that kids their age are reading and decision makers and policymakers aren't looking at, then it's a little bit lost, right? So it's important that we direct kids to these avenues, these databases, report queries, these opportunities, and they're things that we as parents and adults can go through and filter and vet and then direct them to specific opportunities. But it's only if they're communicating in, I don't want to discount how they are communicating, but the right places when it comes to impacting policy. Yeah. And then another thing is we really need to guide them in how to communicate, because if they're, so many kids, if I have, they might be looking down, they don't necessarily know. And then this is a bigger problem than ever too, because they're over their devices so much. We need to teach them the power of how to hold yourself, have your eyes up, be articulate, plan ahead of time what you're going to say, think of your audience, because if they stand up and talk about, if let's say they want schools to go back in session and they're only talking about from the standpoint of because kids want this and kids don't like this and so on, their audience of policymakers and parents, that's not going to impact them as much as what are the academic implications, right? What are the political implications? Things like that. So they really need some guidance in stepping into the audience's shoes, figuring out what is going to drive the audience, and then what's needed, such as pairing a powerful emotional story with some data, with some research. And we can guide them in some very easy ways to do some online research and how to evaluate good sources, so that if they go in there with a powerful story and with hard evidence, and they know how to communicate that well, suddenly they're so compelling. So it's where they're communicating and how they're communicating.
Yeah, and when I think about the examples you already gave of Malala or Greta, those are both cases where they were very in front of the mainstream media, and that's where most of us were exposed to them. It wasn't in the back channels of social media. And both examples as well, they came at it with data, but not straight at us with the bullet points. They had a compelling story. There was emotion, and I think authenticity is a word that really comes to mind in both of those cases in particular, where that was like the first invitation in was like their authenticity, their emotional rawness that they were out there, but obviously backed by something more than just raw emotion. In Greta's case, we're talking about climate change and the data that she brought in, and I don't know. Maybe you know more about her origin story, but how did she make that journey from obviously very passionate and inspired young person into the limelight like that?
I think, and I could be wrong on this, but my understanding is that she started it was every Friday. She started doing she boycotted school every Friday in this sort of sit-in, this kind of, and that gained some media attention. And then pretty soon there was, let's get her down to this, meeting of, UN and all these big places that she went. But I wish I knew more of the specifics on that. But I do know that it started. She's an activist, much like Malala. Same thing, an activist. When Malala was shot by the Taliban, it was because she was attending school, despite the fact that was not allowed. She was on a bus. She was going. So they were activists, and I think all those things that we do with our kids, where hey, if you disagree with us, like I've taken my daughter on Black Lives Matter marches, and I've taken her. I remember we were protesting at a particular zoo that was using the electrocution on an elephant ride, and she was so young. I had her little sign on her stroller. And then as soon as they get old enough, you want to definitely be listening to them. Like, well, this is what we know about this situation. How do you feel about this? Because you also don't want to push your agenda, you know? For example, I'm vegan, and my daughter's husband, or my daughter's father, my ex-husband, eats whatever. So we just raised her in the middle. And as soon as she was able, you know, from maybe she was 4 or 5, started just saying, well, it's up to you. You know, it's up to you. Make your own decisions, whatever you want to do, and without judgment, without, are you sure you want to eat that? You know, that kind of thing. We really need to be sure that we're hearing them and what they're passionate about, and we're not just pushing them out as a mouthpiece for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how twice in a row you used activist, and with the emphasis on the act part. Like there's a distinct difference between just voicing a raw reaction, using social media, for example, as a platform to just voice some emotion or some reaction, which could be healthy. And someone in the case of Malala, in the case of Parkland, in the case of Greta, there was activism involved. Like there was action before the words, before the sharing. And maybe that's getting to the root of it a bit. And if so, no, go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think, Sarah, I'm such an interrupter. I'm so bad. I think, too, when you raise a child to be an activist on issues that your child seems sincerely interested in, like loves animals or whatever it is, I think that then when opportunities hit for the child to step up and be a bigger voice, for example, perfect example, the Parkland students and the shooting, they already have that experience of being an activist, and so they're ready to go. You know, they're ready to talk on the issue. They're ready to sit down and show their passion. They're not kind of standing around, you know, this horrible thing happened, what do I do? Because they've already been through those steps. When you see an injustice or you see a problem, you step up. You try to change.
Yeah, I love that. So can we do kind of a light scenario here that I think might help? Whether there might be some parents watching here who have kids who are kind of in that activist mindset, but don't know quite how or where to channel it in an effective and safe way. There might be even some kids listening in who have that mindset, some older kids. And so like this is extremely invaluable. This list of ways for me as an adult to get in front of mainstream media to communicate my message. How have you adapted this for someone in that scenario? Like, let's say I'm a 10th grader and I feel really passionately and strongly about a particular cause, and I don't want to be stuck in my vacuum, my social media vacuum with my friends. How can I be a change maker? What do you advise kids like that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because there are definitely added considerations when we're working with youth that we need to look out for. One is we have to be sure that they have strong digital citizenship and they understand the implications of things. Because if we have, for example, let's say you have a child who's 6 that has a bedwetting issue, and the child is talking about it on local media, well, that's going to be around forever, and that could really cause the child to feel some shame down the line. And so we want to be very sensitive to, is this something that first of all, the kid should know this will be around forever. and is this something that we're sure that he or she will always be glad he or she did? We also want to be sure the child is set up for success. If you know that the child's going to talk with the reporter, for example, can you ask for some questions ahead of time? It's not always done with adults, but for the child to be sure the child can not practice in a robotic way, but just feel more comfortable. So we want to make it a more comfortable experience for the child. We also want to be sure, I touched on earlier, that this really is the child's passion, and it's not being hoisted on the child by the parent or somebody else or an organization that just wants, hey, let's push a kid out there and say, have the kid say he's really happy about this, when he isn't. So those are things to look out for, and to really help the kid know how to present and know how to communicate. So just through practice, so that when the child is on the news or on the radio or the opportunity arises, the kid can be successful. Because otherwise, if it goes really poorly and the child is stammering and the child doesn't know what to say, that bad experience might hold that person back in the future. So that's something to look out for too. And again, too, parental consent. And not all journalists are familiar with this, that you can't just grab a kid off the street. And, if it's a minor, somebody under the age of 18, you need to have parental or caregiver consent. So the parent needs to be, or caregiver needs to be, a strong advocate of, hey, I need to know what happens, and I have to be present. I'm not going to send my child off with the reporter in another room where I'm not there. There are added safety concerns that we want to look out for. And two, think of the repercussions bullying wise, if the school, if peers hear that kind of thing. So there are just these extra sensitivities that if you're careful with them, you can be sure that it's a positive experience for the kid.
Yeah, and I just want to echo that with a really positive example that there's actually a person who has been a guest on this podcast named Paisley. She is, I think, 6 years old now, and she is a student activist. So this is a true story. About a year and a half ago, I get a LinkedIn message from, I think she was already 5 at the time, from a 5-year-old. She's introduced herself, and she had a passion for education for refugees. And she wanted to know, would I, as the CEO of New Minds, be interested in collaborating? And I sat on it for a while. I wasn't sure, what is this? I got a follow-up from Paisley's mom shortly after, reassuring me, yes, this is real. Paisley writes all of her own emails and messages. That's her asking you legitimately. But just know that I manage all her accounts as well, and I'm here. And so I ended up having the meeting and learning Paisley's story. And so here's what happened. She was maybe 4 years old and first encountered this concept, this reality of refugees. And she saw some images and heard stories of what refugees go through. And she was absolutely moved, at the soul level, and decided to dedicate herself to helping refugees. Now, the first couple of things she did as an activist were simple, like collect stuffed animals and collect basic supplies and have them shipped. And they delivered some supplies to the caravan a couple of years ago that was heading through Central America. And she has helped build a refugee education center in Greece, for example, and just doing some amazing things. But she's an example of someone who has, first of all, extremely supportive parents kind of coaching her along, keeping her safe, but letting her voice unfold kind of organically and authentically. And coaching her on all those things you mentioned. As you were going through them, I was kind of thinking through and checking the boxes, because of course I was skeptical in the beginning. I thought, wow, is this really coming all from her, or is she kind of just being coached, or is it kind of more of a group effort? But no, having known Paisley now for a long time, this is completely, and in fact it's the opposite. She's dragging her parents along on this journey.
I love it,
because she's fueled by her own interest and passion. So I think there are more and more examples like that out there, and there's something, like you said just a few minutes ago, there's something especially compelling when it is a student voice. And you really said something even before that struck me, and that in all the body of educational research, the richest and most valuable resource are the students themselves, and it's the one that we hear the least from. When you said that, when you just stated that simple statement, it was almost like a mind blown moment, because I'm like, oh my goodness, you're right. all this time and researches and these meticulously designed studies sometimes neglect the most basic thing right in front of us, which is the student voice. That's really incredible.
And they're for the most part so eager to share. When we do give kids a chance to talk, or teens a chance to talk, they'll tell you what's wrong with the class. They'll tell you what they want about a certain situation. We just have to ask and give them those opportunities.
Yeah. So, all right. So we had so many topics we could have tackled in this episode. I'm glad that we chose this one, because I think it's really relevant in a moment when education is going through an acceleration of its revolution. At New Minds, we knew the revolution was coming. That's why we started in 2013 talking about it. but we involuntarily as a world have kind of had to accelerate through the evolution of education, and we're in really crazy moments. So maybe now more than ever is a moment to listen to those student voices about what the next version of education needs to look like.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that we chose this topic, and I'll put as many links as I can in the show notes here for people to find some resources on what you're doing. Your website is right there on screen, jennygrankin.com. Now, as we depart here, is there anything that you're working on now that's in your pipeline that has you either excited or intrigued that you can share?
Yeah, I'm working for my 13th book. I'm going to write my first mainstream book that's not just for researchers or educators.
Okay.
And it's all about merging data with storytelling to convey what would normally be really boring information, how to convey it in ways that are memorable and actionable and likely to render change. So I'm really excited about that one. I've been just plugging away on it bit by bit.
Okay, I love that, and I'm sure there's a connection and link to the TED Talk where you talk about data visualization, and I'll put a link in the show notes to that as well. I mean, the examples were powerful. Was it Florence Nightingale? The example that
yes,
you gave, that she wanted to convince them to redirect some of the funding from weapons into like actual healthcare. The only way to do that was to convince them with a very cool graphical representation of why people were dying, and that was enough. So cool. And a whole book on stuff like that sounds absolutely intriguing. So I can't wait to see that, and I hope when that is out or sooner, you can come back on the show and we can have more discussions, because we could literally do 10 episodes just with what you've done.
I would love that. I love your show, and it's really been an honor to be on it. Thanks so much.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Stay safe. I know you're in California. Before the show, we were chatting. I know you're not personally in danger with the fires, but we hope you stay safe, you and your family. And thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much.
Okay.